Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Emotional Grit, the podcast where you can learn about the power of perspective and the science that fuels us. I'm your host, Jennifer Fernjack, and I'm incredibly grateful to say that my guest today is Mary Palcich Keys. She's a historian, and the theme for today's episode is comforts of home. A lot of us want to think that we can actually be in a home by choice, but what if that decision is made for you as far as if you have to move? Or in a case that she'll talk about today, where the whole town had to move. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. But please feel free to like and subscribe to the podcast on YouTube at Emotional Grit. And thanks for joining us today. And thank you, Mary, for joining us today.
Thank you for asking me, Jennifer.
So first of all, I want to kind of define for people or give some examples of like the feelings of home or comforts of home. I know, for example, for myself, I think about how when I was growing up, I would go to summer camp. And the first time that I went, it was going to be kind of a little daunting thing to go away from home for a week. And this is, of course, long before it was possible to email someone or text someone or what have you.
Mhm.
So I didn't learn until years later that my mom would write me a letter the day that the bus would leave for camp. That way she'd make sure that the letter got to camp while I was still there. But it was to have those feelings, that connectedness at home. Also, I know that some people that go on business trips have a good time on the trip, but they view going home as a positive thing to go like sleep in their own bed. But that it can also be kind of subjective because there are also some people who view being on the road as their home. I know hotels have turn down services, and sometimes they'll have cookies at the front desk to make things more comfortable for people. But as far as kind of the science behind it and how it kind of makes people feel, I do want to read a little excerpt here from my book. So what I wrote here is, okay, so it's a yearning for the familiar, a setting that's predictable and known, in which it thereby offers comfort and a sense of control. The more positive experiences you have at a given place, the greater the attachment and the opportunity to bond with it. So obviously, when your whole town has to move, that's got to be a kind of a hard thing to get your head around. So could you please give people the backdrop and just kind of the story of what happened to Hibbing, Minnesota?
Sure. So I'm in Hibbing and I was born and raised in Hibbing. And for those of you who don't know where Hibbing is, it's 70 miles north of Duluth and about 70, 80 miles south of the Canadian border. So we're on the area of Minnesota known as the Arrowhead. And this is also known as the Mesabi Iron Range, which is the longest and widest iron range anywhere. Hibbing, of course, as a town, began in 1892. But before that, this land belonged to the First Nations peoples
Mm.
from the 1600s on.
Oh, wow.
The Anishinaabe, which includes the Chippewa and the Ojibwe. But we know that other First Nations groups came through this area and lived here for periods of time. We know people have been living on this land for at least 1600 years. We don't know very much about them.
Wow.
There were at least 4 glaciers that covered this land. And from the time of that last glacier melting, we know people lived at the edge of that glacier.
Wow.
So then the Anishinaabe eventually come here in the 1600s, and they are living here. And eventually the first whites come into this land exploring and then as fur traders. And the land really isn't changed very much by that. But beginning in the late 1800s, the lumber companies, which had made their way across Michigan and northern Wisconsin, now got their sights set on Minnesota. And they're coming into this land and they are cutting down these enormous white pines, is specifically what we had here. There were some oaks also, but white pine is what they wanted. And treaties were made and broken and made and broken. And the First Nations peoples are pushed out of this land. And once that white pine was gone, then prospectors come into this land. And what do you think they were looking for? What do prospectors always look for first? Gold.
Gosh, I'm thinking of just different commodities, whether it
Gold.
was, oh
Gold.
yeah, okay, gold rush, all right.
That's what they want. And there really wasn't gold up here. But those prospectors, their compass wheels would swing and they'd bounce, and they knew that was caused by iron in the ground. But in the 1800s, iron wasn't really an important commodity yet because the Industrial Revolution was just starting. There were some iron mines in eastern states. Nobody really thought much about it. Well, by the end of the 1800s, though, iron is the number one thing because the country is growing and it needs railroad tracks and it needs bridges and it's going to eventually build skyscrapers, and iron is needed. So you get prospectors coming into this land. And one of those prospectors was a German immigrant by the name of Frank Hibbing. And he comes with his men into this area, and he comes out of his tent on a very cold January day, as only northern Minnesota January mornings can be.
We don't have cold winters. What are you talking about?
Oh, nothing like they
Yeah.
are up here.
Yeah.
Comes out of his tent and he says to the men who are with him, "I believe there's iron under my feet. My bones feel rusty." And he tells the men to dig. And they don't have to go down very far into the ground, that frozen ground, denuded of most trees. But what they come up with, if you think about the flour you bake with, but think about it being a rust color.
Okay.
And that's what they were coming up with. That is the purest iron ore that's ever been found anywhere in the world.
Oh.
So they knew that there was going to be a mine here. Now, there were already mines on the south shore of Lake Vermilion, the Vermilion Iron Range. There were already mines to the east of us. And now there's going to be a mine here. By the way, the men wanted to name, Frank Hibbing wanted to name the town Superior because of the quality of the ore. But the men he was with insisted the town's going to be called Hibbing. So he tells them, though, don't build the town here, because he knew what was in the ground. Well, Jennifer, you know how men listen. And they built the town there. And it was a beautiful town. Before a few years had gone by, it was a town of 18,000 people. This was not a little village. This was a good-sized town. In the middle of northern Minnesota's wilderness, at least that was the thought to most people, it was wilderness. It was a town with electric lighting. In fact, so much electric lighting on the main street of Hibbing that it was called the Great White Way. And it had indoor plumbing. And they had a central heating system that sent steam heat out into the community. It had a Carnegie Library. It had a beautiful Lincoln High School. It was a wealthy, wealthy community. And it was sitting on that rich iron ore. By the time of 1910, 1912, Hibbing, the town, is actually sitting on a peninsula surrounded by open pits and underground mines all around it. And imagine you're in your house and you're having dinner and they blast in the mine to break up the rock. Now, today blasting is much more controlled. Then it was dynamite and it just went off. And you're eating at your kitchen table and everything shakes and the whole house shakes and a few things fall off your walls probably. If the kids were in school and there was a blast, they learned how to duck and cover their heads because rocks could come flying in the school window.
Wow. Okay.
But it was a beautiful town. And remember, these people who came here, in most cases, came with nothing. My 4 grandparents came from Slovenia with nothing. And imagine those who came to a nice town and settle in, and your kids are going to a good school, and you have beautiful churches, all made out of brick and stone, and you have neighbors, all different nationalities. We can identify on the Iron Range 43 different ethnic groups who live here.
Really?
And so these people are are here in this beautiful place, but the mining company wants what's in the ground. And World War I is underway, and iron is really needed now for ships and guns and ammunition. And by the middle of the 1915, 1916, 1917, the mining company is ready to pull the plug on that town to get what's in the ground. And thankfully, we had a brilliant mayor by the name of Victor Power. And Victor Power, his picture hangs in our Historical Society Museum, along with pictures of all of our mayors. And I always tell our curator, under Victor's picture, we should have a votive light burning at all times. Because if it wasn't for Victor Power, we sure as shooting wouldn't have a town that looks the way it does today. Because
Wow.
Victor Power fought the mining company all the way to the state Supreme Court to get past what was called an ad valorem tax. And that ad valorem tax said to the mining companies, and this was true for all across the Iron Range, not just Hibbing, all across the range, to the mining companies, all the property that you own, you're going to be taxed on, whether or not you mine it. See, because that was one of their tricks. Then they would close the mine.
They'd force you out.
You're going to pay tax as long as you own that property. And most of that tax is going to stay in the communities where the mines are located. So, and he had seen what had happened in West Virginia and Tennessee and Kentucky. And I always say to people, if it wasn't for Victor Power, we would look like that. We don't because of Victor Power. Now, that mining tax didn't last forever, that ad valorem tax, but it lasted long enough that towns could invest in civic improvements. And so you get beautiful libraries, you get wide streets, you get paved streets, you get sewer systems, you get water systems. All of that paid for because there was the money available. However, the deal that he made was, we will move our town. We'll give you what's in the ground. And think how much it must have been worth that the mining company was willing to agree.
Right.
So they're going to move the town. They're going to move it about 2 miles south of where the town of Hibbing was. And that they begin building the infrastructure right after World War I ends. So 1919, they're starting to lay out the new town. And by 1920, they're beginning to move. And they will eventually move over 250 buildings. And the move of Hibbing is considered one of the great engineering feats of the 20th century. And it is still studied today. Our curator at the Hibbing Historical Society Museum will get calls and asking for information from engineering companies from all over the world. A few years ago, she sent them like 10 pictures, close-up showing how this was done, for a textbook company in Britain that was putting out a new textbook, because buildings are still moved today, the occasional building. And obviously there are some buildings that couldn't be moved. The Carnegie Library, because it was brick. Many of the churches couldn't be moved because they were brick and stone. The Lincoln High School couldn't be moved. But if you had a wooden building, even large ones, they moved them, 250 of them, and really only one collapsed in that move.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
That's amazing. So what are some of the ways they moved them?
Well, do you want me to show you some pictures?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so here we go. I'm just going to show this one first, because this shows, this little engine is called a dinky. And these were used down in the mines. These are a little train engine that burns coal and makes steam. And they would hook it up to your house. And off you would go. Now, I'll show you a close-up so that you can see the underneath. Now, this is a hotel. And you see what's called cribbing. And cribbing is big pieces of timber, and then the railroad car wheels are what are going to roll it. But that cribbing is a temporary support or a temporary foundation to the building as it moves. And they don't move fast, right? They're moving slowly, and there are men walking in front of them. I'm going to show
So
you.
so you mentioned timber, like people had to literally go cut down trees to have the logs under the homes,
Underneath.
or
Yep.
that's
And
interesting.
they'd reuse them. They keep reusing them. And actually a lot of the support timbers were the same thing that they would use for railroad tracks, for the cross ties on the railroad tracks. But like, here's a crew of men. They're getting ready to sit, look at that big hotel, 3 stories. And there will be men who will walk backwards the whole way, and they're watching to see that the building is staying flat. And if it's starting to slant a little bit, then they're going to stop, and they're going to jack up that side. If they're add a little bit more wood, then they'll keep going, and then maybe another corner of the building is kind of sinking. Okay, we're going to jack that up.
Wow.
If you had a small house to go from North Hibbing, which is the original Hibbing, we now refer to it as North Hibbing, it would take maybe a day. They'd start in the morning, and by night you would be at your new location. Some of these, though, these big buildings, these would take days, several days to do. Now, I love this one, and I know you might not be able to see it, but there's a hotel in the distance. See, and here's another one closer. So they came right after one another. This is 3rd Avenue, which you come to visit Hibbing today, and you're going to take 3rd Avenue up to the Mine View, and that water tower is still there. And they moved the town. And you have to remember, though, for these people who were living there, and like I said, they had their churches and their school and their neighbors and their gardens. And now you're telling me I have to move? And everybody's not going to be living by each other anymore. And I think about how hard it was for them to do that,
Oh
to
yeah.
pick up again when you finally put your roots down and you finally have friends, all these different neighbors, and now we're going to pick up and move. And I will tell you, here in northern Minnesota, there were all kinds of mines, hundreds of mines, some underground, some open pit. And there would be little what we call mining locations, which were little towns where the miners lived right by a mine. Because before people had cars and there really wasn't public transportation, they're going to walk to work. They're going to walk to the mine. And when that mine shut down, they'd pick up those houses and move them to the next location.
Were the houses like the company's houses that people just
Yeah.
lived in? Okay.
Yeah. And you'd pay a little rent to them. And usually those houses were for families. So a miner who had a wife and children would get generally the houses. Then there were boarding houses, which were the places where the single men lived. And of course, some of those locations and some of the smaller towns never were moved. They stayed, and once people got cars, then they just bought their houses and they stayed there. And eventually some of those locations, because the mines expanded, like in North Hibbing, that pit is going to grow, they're going to want that land. And so they began to buy out people. And I'll tell you, there are some very, very sad, heartbreaking stories of some people just couldn't leave. And some of these happened like in the 1960s because they were, the mines were growing. And I know one woman who committed suicide, an elderly woman. This was her home. This is where she raised her children.
Well,
this is her garden.
That is what I was alluding to at the very beginning of the episode, how it's that sense of home, it's feelings of home. It's not only, as I alluded to, little kids who go to camping and then get homesick, or people who are traveling for business, oftentimes look forward to getting home. It's also the elderly who don't want to go to a assisted living center or a nursing home or what have you. They want to stay where they have those memories. They want to stay with what's familiar and the nostalgia and all that kind of stuff. And it's moves aren't just physical, they also could be emotional and psychological. And so it's important to recognize that. And when you mentioned that that, of course, the buildings moved. And it's my understanding from what I've read, and from what I've been told before, that the buildings weren't always in the same order that they were before. And so I think back to when I was in college, not until the 1990s, but when I was going to college in Duluth, which for those of you who are listening who aren't from Minnesota, Duluth is by Lake Superior, just for some context. But I remember at a party that my roommates and I had, one of my roommates is from a small town outside of Hibbing. And so one of her high school friends came to join us. And her friend was sharing this story about how her family went back multiple generations in Hibbing, and how, I believe it was her grandpa, if I'm not mistaken, joined the military. So he leaves Minnesota, serves with the military, comes back, not knowing the town had moved. And he's like, "Where's my family?" It's like, where did they go? And so he was told the town moved. He goes to where it moved to, and the houses weren't in the same order per se. So the big joke was something to the effect of, maybe if I had done my chores, my family wouldn't have moved without me, ha, when I was little, whatever. But it's just kind of that, it messes with
Yeah.
your mind.
Yes. And, I understand exactly what you're saying, Jennifer, about the emotion of it. I
Mhm.
grew up here, but went to college in the cities in the mid 70s. I could hardly wait to see Hibbing in the rearview mirror. I had no plans on coming back.
Yes.
And the years go by, and elderly parents, and I was up here so much through all of those years, and Joe and I were up here all the time. But after my dad passed away, we made the very difficult decision to sell the dream house, which we had designed and built in the cities, and give up the jobs and move to Hibbing, where we bought the bookstore, which was not a career that either of us had ever had. And that was 21 years ago. And I say to people, I came kicking and screaming, not because that by this point I hated Hibbing or anything, I didn't, but because of the insecurity of I knew what I had in St. Paul. I knew what Joe's job was. I knew what he earned. I knew the health insurance.
Which
And
offers
now,
control.
yes,
It's familiarity. It's things that are known.
yes.
Yeah.
And you have your doctor and you have your dentist and you have your
Yep.
hairdresser and you have the neighbors. And now we're going to start over, and we were not young kids when we did this. So it was a challenge. It was a risk. It's worked out way better than I ever thought. Um, but it makes me even more empathetic, I think, to those people, well, who left their home countries, like my four
Yeah.
grandparents,
Mhm.
didn't speak a word of English, landed at Ellis Island, somehow found their way to northern Minnesota, for God's sakes, and then yes, then move, and then having to move even within this area. So it
It's a big
does make
deal. It's a very big deal.
it's a very big deal. And I know for some people it's like, oh, it's a house, oh, who cares? Move to one
Mm,
town is the same as another. There were
mm-mm.
people who had no idea why I was crying my eyes out to leave my house.
It's true. It's true. And
But
um, I think maybe about 2017 or 18, maybe some friends and I were up on the Iron Range, going skiing at Giants Ridge. And I love going skiing there. But I remember one night we wanted to go to the R Bar for pizza. And so someone had said, you got to go to this little hole in the wall place that has like good food, and it's just kind of fun. Excuse me. Plus it's very historic. So we go to the R Bar and we start talking to the server, and we said, what's the history of this building? We're all history buffs, like what's the history? And I am so glad that I asked, because unfortunately a year or two later, the bar actually burned down. It's located it was located in Bewabic.
in Blavic.
Yeah. And the server, it was either the server or the bartender offered to give us a tour of the basement. So we went down these little stairs, which now would not be anywhere near like OSHA standards or
No,
whichever governing body that would be out there now. But we went down these little stairs into the basement, And there were all these little divided rooms. And it turns out the history of them is they were, people in the Twin Cities down here call them saunas. But I know up there it's pronounced sauna because that's the proper
That's
Finnish
the
pronunciation.
Finnish name, the Finnish
Yes,
pronunciation.
yes.
Hmm?
But they were all little individual saunas. And the person told us that when people would go down there, oftentimes they'd worked at the iron at one of the mines first. And given the fact that back when the bar first opened, because so many people were from different countries and maybe lived on different streets, like it's my understanding, and tell me if this is different, but like one street might have a lot of Italian people, another street might have a lot of people from like an Eastern Bloc country or what have you. And not only were there different languages, but sometimes there could be different clothing as well. Like you may be able to tell someone's background based on how they dressed. But in these little individual saunas, it was almost like the great equalizer because they all were just wearing a towel, if wearing a towel at all, because it
Yeah.
was just cultural norms were a little bit different. But
Hmm.
no one was wearing their clothing that might make you understand like where they were from. It's like you
Hmm.
all were kind of equal. And if somebody in one of these little saunas wanted another beer or perhaps another bar of soap or whatever, they would pull on a rope. The
Hmm.
rope then went up the stairs to behind the bar where a bell would then ring. So the bartender then knew to go back downstairs and give you
Find
whatever
out
you
what they
needed.
needed. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, just they figured out the how. It was just this way to have this a community to unite people. And I just think that's absolutely fascinating.
Well, and
And
it's like what you said about how if you have to leave, if you have to make that adjustment in your life, how do you how do you cope with it? So how do
yeah,
you make it work?
yeah.
And that was a way. Churches were a big way that,
Mm,
and yes, there were like I'm Catholic, so in Hibbing we had the Italian Catholic Church, and then we had Blessed Sacrament, which was everybody else. And
ah,
in different towns there might be a Polish church, or of course the Eastern or Ukrainian
yeah.
church, and then the Greek Orthodox Church or a Russian Orthodox Church. But
Oh,
though it so that gave you a sense of home, but it also in a church like Blessed Sacrament meant everybody was going to be there together going to Mass. And because in those days Mass was said in Latin and everybody learned enough Latin to go through a Mass,
yeah,
that brought you together. Whereas
absolutely.
my grandparents in their little villages in Slovenia, when they'd go to Mass on Sunday, it was just with the people in the village. But now all of a sudden you're at Mass with somebody who owns a clothing store, or the woman down the street who is Italian and you're Slovenian, but you're both at Mass together. And like my mom said, the Slovenians never knew what tomatoes were. They didn't grow tomatoes, but they came here and they had Italian neighbors and they learned about tomatoes and they learned about spaghetti. And the Italians learned about pizza from the Slovenians. So they learned each other's cultures. Um, it's not really the melting pot because that I think that kind of sense gives you a sense that you've given up
Yeah,
everything.
yeah.
Um,
Well, I can tell you, having grown up in Cloquet, which is what, probably an hour south maybe of Hibbing, if that.
mhm.
But again, northern Minnesota. And when I was growing up, there was no World Wide Web. You couldn't just Google stuff. It didn't exist yet. So I can tell you that growing up in a very small town, that I didn't know until after college when I moved to the Twin Cities about different foods. I had never heard of couscous before. I'd never heard of baklava before. I'd never, I mean, just, and I remember one time I went on a business trip to New York and someone had mentioned that a breakfast buffet was put outside of the conference room where we were working. And I
Mhm.
said, "Oh, that's great." And I'm picturing like pasta, not pasta, pastries
Yeah.
maybe, or some fruit or whatever.
Mhm.
And someone said, "Oh yeah, there's lox available." And in my
Oh.
mind, I thought, as in of hair. Like I didn't know what I mean, I was being facetious, but I'd never heard of it before. And so I said, "Well, what's a lock?" And so I said, "Oh, well, it's fish." And my first thought was, wow, people eat fish for breakfast? Like I had never even heard of that before. But that kind of brought on part of my love for travel, about not knowing, like I didn't know what I didn't know, and it's learning that kind of stuff that's just fascinating. And there are people that I'll meet when I'm traveling where they're like, what's lutefisk? What does that mean? But being from Minnesota, especially up north, I was used to people talking about it. And even just different terminology too. Like to this day, when I travel, if I use the word pop instead of soda, people are like, oh, you must be from the Midwest.
Yep,
They just
yep,
don't know. But
there we
but
are.
really interesting stuff. But so circling back to your bookstore, would you mind sharing with listeners how initially when the open pit mine blasts would go off, how if I remember correctly, the window in your store up front would kind of shake and what have you, which may have been kind of annoying to some people, but to other people, it's like, hey, you know what? It is what it is. But then just kind of what happened when the economy slowed down, and then when the blasts came back later, what
Yeah.
your thoughts were.
So our storefront had large single pane glass windows that had probably been there for close to 100 years, because the street on Howard Street, all of the buildings were built by the mining company at the time that the town moved. And so they were all these beautiful brick buildings. And our bookstore was one of those original buildings. It had like 4 different businesses in it in those years. So we didn't own the building. We rented the building. And when there would be a blast, and I told you the blasts today are much more controlled than they were. But if the blast was near the south side of the pit, closest to where the town of Hibbing is today, you feel it, and you feel it in your feet. Almost like I say to people who from California come for tours, I have been told that you feel that earthquake hitting the bottom of your foot. Well, you feel it, so you feel it in the ground, but you also often hear it, and the whole building is shaking. Okay, so blast would go off 11 o'clock Tuesdays used to be typically
Ah, yeah, yeah,
blast.
yeah.
So somewhere close to 11 o'clock, there'd be the blast. And everything in the store shakes. And then if I'm up front, I'm going to see that pane, which at that time was just single pane glass, and it would bow out and it would bow back in. And I mean, literally, you could see the glass bow out and bow back in. And there'd be times it would go so far out, I think, this is the day the glass cracks, then bows back in. So one day there's an elderly woman in the store, and I knew her, and there's the blast, everything shakes. And she says to me, Mary, one of these days that blast is going to crack your ceiling. I said, Irene, I don't care. I don't own the building, can't stand the landlord, so I don't care if it cracks. And Irene, every blast means money. Every
It's true.
blast means
It's
money.
true.
And the train tracks pass very close to the back of our building. And that would be another thing. Sometimes those trains would come and they're so loud, and they even shake the building, coming through, especially if they're loaded. And I'd say to Joe, every train means money. Every train means money. Well, then, and I had told Joe, because he's not from here, and I had told him when we were making that decision to come up here, this is life on the Iron Range. Up and down, up and down. It has its peaks. Everybody's at work. Every plant is working. Everybody is flat out working. And then down it comes. And then you're sitting at the bottom for a while and praying it's going to go back up.
I assume it's because it's a community that's based around a single industry.
Well, and they've really tried to diversify. For instance,
Yeah.
Hibbing is a very big medical center for this part of northern Minnesota. So you've got
But was
that.
it back then? Was it back
And,
then?
from when I was growing up in the 70s, each town had its own hospital. So it wasn't the way it is now. That has changed. And of course, there's always been lumbering. There's,
Mhm.
that is still very much a part of what we do here. and there are smaller industries. There was a big electronics plant here for a period of time. So you're always trying to diversify. But to this day, the mines are still the driver
Mhm.
because there's the mine, but then there's the suppliers who supply them with tires and oil and replacement parts and toilet paper, and I mean there's all the supplies that come to a mine. So I said to Joe before we moved up here, be aware that there are these times, it's bottom here, and and that could be because there were layoffs because the national economy is crashing. That can be because um, there's a strike going on for the miners to get, better pay or better working conditions or days off or whatever. So there are reasons that these things happen, but they happen. And we went through in 2008 as part of the national economy, everything went down. And there were a lot of our regular customers we didn't see, and so you kind of, everybody's waiting. And then you come through that, you start going up again, and you hear the blast the first time, and you look at each other and you say, that's good news. That's
So
good.
it goes to show you, it's a good example of how in life, it's not always what happens that's the problem per se, it's how you perceive it. Because either way, the blast was a blast, but it was how you looked at it because now you're looking at it through a lens of gratitude.
Yep.
And that's having the power of perspective is such an important thing. I think that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's
And
amazing.
like right now, one of the mines has closed down. Um, the Hibbing taconite, which is the big plant here, has gone into a sort of part of it shut down, about 2/3 of it is shut down. And that's when you can risk losing your young families,
Oh,
because
yeah.
if you're older, you can hang on, you're retired, but if you've got two little kids to feed and take care of, maybe maybe one of you has a job at the hospital. So you're going to maybe hang on a little bit,
Mhm.
but it's risky. And we don't want to see that. This happened in the mid 80s. It was very bad up here, and lots of the plants closed and some permanently. And we lost a lot of young families.
Oh,
And that changes your community because
oh,
you're
yeah.
losing everybody then. Some of them came back, some of them tried it in other places and said, I'd rather hang on with a job at McDonald's than not be here.
Right. Right.
Home is what you define it as.
It's right here. Exactly. Yes. And it's kind of like similar to the idea that being invited somewhere can be different than feeling welcome somewhere. It's intent. It's a matter of how comfortable do you feel. It can be very subjective, And I know
Mhm.
that one example of like a sense of community that I experienced up on the Iron Range is similar to what I've experienced other places in Minnesota as well. But it happened on one of my ski trips when I'm up there skiing at Giants Ridge, and I'm in a rental SUV with my friends, and I was driving. I made the mistake of turning down what I thought was a frontage road that had snow on it. Turns out it was a snowmobile trail
Uh-oh,
that was meant to be a little bit more narrow. So
not a good
not not
idea.
not not one of my finer moments. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So obviously we get stuck. And a friend of mine was from out of state and began panicking and was like, it's dark outside, like there were no street lights, like it was dark outside. No one's gonna know that we're here. We're gonna get stuck overnight. It's gonna be cold and like just spin, spin, spin. And I was cool as a cucumber. And so were my other friends from Minnesota. And my friend that's from out of state was like, how can you be so calm? And without missing a beat, I said, someone will stop to help. And this person's like, how can you be so sure that even if a car goes by that they'll help? And before I could even answer, sure enough, this truck is going to drive by, but they saw us and they stopped. And
Yep.
it looked like it was a father and son. They go to the back of their truck, they get out the shovels they already had, they come over. I don't think they even said hi, that they just came out,
Start
like shovel us
shoving.
out. And as we're trying to say thank you, they're already heading back to their truck and driving away. And my friend from out of state was just dumbfounded and is like, What
Oh,
just happened?"
oh,
And
the
it's the fact that when you grow up and live in a cold climate, that yes, right now somebody else is stuck, but maybe tomorrow it's you. And you hope that someone helps you. So
right.
there's that sense of community. And believe it or not, the cold weather can actually be a way to connect people because we're all experiencing it together. And
Yep.
so you learn in those moments. And it was amazing because yeah, and even growing up, I know that there was a car one time that got stuck outside our house, and my dad went out and helped the guy try to push the car, and my mom gave them food,
Mm,
and I remember as a little kid, a few days later, the couple that had been stuck came back to our house and gave us some food. I think they
nice.
made us like a hot dish or something. But again, it's interesting how, in this case, it's the cold weather. For you, it might have been kind of being like in a mining community and doing things together, but those kinds of things can actually unite people. And, it's really amazing
And
stuff.
when before we had moved back up here, um, and I couldn't be here all the time, and my parents would go off and do something downtown, and oh, I think twice Dad locked the keys in the car, or they had bought a dehumidifier, and now how in the world are they elderly people going to get this home? And in all of these cases, virtual strangers stepped up to help.
Ah,
And mom would tell me the story later, she'd call me later and, oh, you know what happened to us today? And she'd tell me, and I'd say, thank you, God, that there were these angels.
hmm
And when as they as they got worse and we moved up here, even when we were here, we needed those angels. And in many cases, they were people we had never known before.
ah,
Um, Recently, Joe and I now have an elderly woman friend who's living in an assisted living. She wants to continue to go to her book club. Of course, she doesn't drive anymore. So every once a month, Joe goes and picks her up and takes her to book club. And an hour and a half later, he goes and gets her and takes her home. And she's living in a neighboring community in an assisted living. She's not right in Hibbing.
mm,
But we said somebody did that for us, for my
ah,
parents. It took a load
mhm.
off our mind. Now we can help them. I hope someday when we're old and need help and
Yeah.
stuck, that's that somebody helps us, that the karma comes around.
Absolutely. Well, in my book, I wrote about the science of kindness and how when you do something nice for somebody else, of course, the recipient benefits, but you as the person who initiates it can get what's called a helper's high. It's a serotonin rush. So that's why it can feel good to give an elderly person your seat on a bus or to go shovel someone's sidewalk anonymously, and because you're not doing it for the thank you.
Yeah.
But and even circling back to the power of perspective when you talk about how up on the range, the whole idea of when the blasts would take place, what was it? Feeling money moving? Was that what it was? Is that how it was
I,
coined?
I would just say every blast is money,
Yes, yes, yes,
because that means the mines are working and they're going to pay their workers and their workers are going to come to your store and
yes.
it's going to
So
circulate.
yeah, so in Cloquet, when I was growing up, we had a paper mill
Yep.
that when you were driving on the highway and just passing Cloquet to go to Duluth, people would smell the paper mill because it smelled almost like sulfur, kind of. And so
Mhm.
when I went to college in Duluth, there were people from Minneapolis who would say, "Hey, Jennifer, where are you from?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm from Cloquet." And they would go, "Oh, that's the town that stinks." And
Uh-huh.
so, and we'd laugh about it. But when I told my grandpa that, he goes, "Well, you can tell your friends that that's the scent of money, or that's
That's
the,
right.
and it's
That's right.
true. It was true.
Absolutely it is.
Power of
Absolutely it
perspective,
is. Yep.
but um I also wanted to call out the fact that the high school in Hibbing is where a very famous singer went to school. And so I'm wondering if you could tell people about just how about Bob Dylan going to school there, and the fact that with his movie that just came out, how you were then able to take the actor that plays him around and all
Yes.
that fun stuff.
Well, the high school in Hibbing is beautiful. Now I'm going to show you. This is a picture. It was built, of course, when the town moved. This was the new high school that was built, and it was built beginning in 1920, 21, 22, 23, and dedicated in 1924. And this was around the time that it was dedicated. And it, the stories about this high school made their way out east, probably with some of the mining men who would come out here, and the New York Times was so intrigued that they sent a reporter out here because they said, surely there can't really be a high school like we're hearing about, with chandeliers and marble stairs and these big wide hallways. So the reporter came and he visited the school and he wrote his article, and the headline of the article read, "I have seen a castle in the wilderness." And here it is.
Wow.
And it looks very much like this today, and it is just as beautiful inside as on the outside. And this is from the air. This is 1935, and you see it's on a 10-acre site. And it is a magnificent high school. But I will also tell you, and I'm the daughter of teachers, and I'm an old teacher, it's great to have a school like this. And I think every school in America should be a temple.
Hmm.
But a good teacher can teach in a tent.
Oh, for sure.
And because of the way that the mining company, that money was structured, Hibbing and the Iron Range in general could pay the highest salaries in a 5-state region. So when you look back at the yearbooks in the past, they would put where the teachers got their degrees from in the yearbook.
Okay.
And you see all the top public universities, and you see things like MIT and Stanford and Notre Dame. And, uh, amazing. That's the kind of teachers that we had. So when Robert Zimmerman was in school, he had those amazing teachers, and we knew many of them because they were still around. Many of them were my teachers then in the 70s, and many of them were close friends of my parents.
Now,
And
just for
yeah,
context, not everybody might know who Rob Zimmerman changed his name to.
changed his name to Bob Dylan. He
Yes.
graduated from Hibbing High School in 1959. He went to the University of Minnesota, though we have no proof that Bob actually sat in a classroom and actually passed a class, because pretty soon he was heading out east to meet Woody Guthrie, who was one of his inspirations. And if you've seen the movie, and I encourage everybody to see the movie, A Complete Unknown, starring Timothee Chalamet as the young Bob Dylan, that's where the movie picks up, is when he arrives in New York City. So there's nothing about his growing up in Hibbing, although there's a marvelous scene in it where one of his friends is flipping through a scrapbook that he had been sent. And as they flip the page on the scrapbook, there's a picture, and it really is Bobby Zimmerman. His mother took that picture. I mean, they've got it there. And there's a picture of the front of the high school. And that's when they're like, where are you from, Bobby? What is this? Because he wanted to create this aura of, oh, I've been a gypsy, I've been traveling with the circus, and a young guy who doesn't want to say I'm from Hibbing, Minnesota, and my dad owns a appliance store. No, he wanted to make it more exciting than that. So anyway, it's a wonderful film, amazing portrayal. And in January of 2024, Timothee Chalamet was in the final stages of what had ended up being a 5-year study of Bob Dylan, because between COVID and then the writer's strike, the actor's strike, the movie kept getting pushed back. Plus, then he had other movies that he had to do before that he was contracted for. So this one, is at the end of the line, basically. So he had 5 years to take guitar lessons, harmonica lessons, singing lessons, speech lessons to get the cadence of Bob Dylan's speech patterns, how he sings. And kind of in those last stages, he wanted to spend some time in Minnesota. And Joe and my names are there for tours of the high school. And so on January 24th, 2024, we get a call in the morning. And Joe said, it was a good thing I had told him recently, there's this movie going to be made about Bob Dylan, and Timothee Chalamet is playing Bob. And we know who Timothee Chalamet was because we've seen his other films. So good thing I said this to Joe, because this fellow on the phone says, I'm Timothee Chalamet's manager. And Joe said, at this point, in the caller ID, it says California. Well, right away you think spam.
Right.
So then this man says, I'm Timothee Chalamet's manager. Joe was like, oh yeah, like, sure you are. I mean, but he knew that made sense. And so they set this up, and Timothee Chalamet the next day, January 25th, my birthday, that's why I remember these dates so perfectly, came and spent the day in Hibbing with us. And we showed him the sites, and obviously he'd already done a lot of Dylan research, and it was great fun because, we'd point out something and he'd say, oh, Joe, can you stop the car? I want to get a picture of this. And he'd hop out with his cell phone, with his smartphone, just like any tourist. Oh, I got to get a picture of this. And he was great. And what was particularly lovely, and I will tell you this, is that the manager, who talked to Joe several times in the course of that day before getting this all set up, said, does Hibbing High School still have a drama program? And Joe said, yes, as a matter of fact, they're in rehearsals right now for competition one act. For those of you not in Minnesota, that's just like any sports event. It's one of the oldest events that the high school league oversees, as a matter of fact, is the one act. And so Joe said, yeah, they're in rehearsal. And the manager said, well, Timothy said, if it's possible, he doesn't want to cause any trouble, or if it's possible, he would like to talk to the high school kids who are in the play. And that was his request. That was not us. And Joe said, oh yeah, we know the director. I think we can work that out with her. And it worked out beautifully. And
really?
Yep. And so if you give me a minute here, I'll show you some pictures. We had the most wonderful time with him. There was nothing, he grew up in New York, went to the Performing Arts High School, LaGuardia, which is the Fame School. A lot of people know it that way.
The TV show Fame?
Yeah, the TV show and the movie Fame, that's based on LaGuardia High School. And I quite loved it because he said to me as we walked down the main hall of Hibbing High School, he said to me, I went to LaGuardia. It was not like this. And I said, no, probably not. No school is. And then we walked into the auditorium, and he was just stunned for a minute. And he looked at me and he said, it really wasn't like this. Because you truly have not seen an auditorium like this one. And I always call it the husband face. People come on a tour, and I can tell some of these husbands have been dragged along by their wife, and they're like, why am I at a high school? Why do I need to go on a tour of a high school? And then they get in, and we can't get them out. But anyway, Timothee Chalamet was wonderful. And I loved our high school kids that day who were in the one act, because of the kind of questions they asked him. Now,
That's so cool he did that.
I don't know if you're going to be able to see that, but
Oh, yeah. Yep.
that's us and Timothy in the high school auditorium. And then let me show you this one, which is him posing with the kids. He's sitting in the front row. He's got that mop of black hair there.
That is really great that he did that.
He was
Wow.
so nice of, and like I said, they'd raise their hand to ask him a question. And I thought one of the really insightful questions one of the kids asked was, do you think it's harder to perform live on stage or in the movies?
Mm.
And he was so thoughtful at, answering their questions. And he said, some actors can do one, but they can't do the other. And there are challenges on both. And then he said, somebody like Denzel Washington is someone who can do both, but a lot of people cannot do both. And you have to find what your strengths are.
Yeah.
So that was lovely of him. And he was here at the end of January, and last winter, a winter ago, we had almost no snow. It was just sporadic, very unnormal. That's not even a good word.
I know what you meant. Yeah.
And it doesn't look pretty. At least if there's piles of snow, I think it looks pretty. So I kept saying to him as we're driving around town, showing him these different Dylan sites, I said, I'm so sorry you're here in this time of year. Come back in the summer, come back in the fall. But he'd say, oh no, I think it looks nice. I think this looks nice. I mean, he was so gracious.
Real genuine guy.
He really was. Yeah. And of course we were able to tell him what were some of the people who had an effect on Bob when Bob was growing up here, and he spent time at the house where Bob grew up. And but he is only one in a string of people that Joe and I have shown around Hibbing who come to Hibbing often because they are Dylan fans, and they make the pilgrimage, we call it. And they come from Israel, they come from Japan, they come from Germany, they come from South Africa, and make this trip to Hibbing like someone else might make it to Liverpool.
Yeah.
Or to Lubbock, Texas.
Wow.
And they make this trip to Hibbing. And then what's nice is they discover that there's this whole other history in Hibbing. There is this history of the town that moved, which kind of takes them aback and blows them away. They're like, what are you talking about? And then they find this high school that's truly like nothing they've ever seen before.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of wonderful because of Bob. And that's kind of one of my lines with people, because they'll often say to me, well, Mary, what if Bob Dylan came one day and, he walked in your bookstore? They used to say, what if he walked in your bookstore? What would you say to him? Or what if you're doing a tour of the high school and he shows up in the group? What would you say to him? And my standard line, and it has been this for years, and it's truly what I would say, Bob, because of you, I have met some of the nicest people in the world. And Timothee Chalamet is an example of that.
Yeah.
Only one of, and some of those people have become truly, really good friends of ours. I mean, we communicate all the time. There's one woman who's taken so many of my tours. I say to her, next time you come up, Nancy, you're going to do the tour, and I'm just
that's funny. That's funny. But and speaking of the Iron Range having a tie to Hollywood, how far away is Hibbing from Grand Rapids, Minnesota? Maybe
30 miles.
Okay, so Grand Rapids, of course, is where Judy Garland and her family lived when she was little, and the house is still there. I toured it a couple years ago. And for me, being from Cloquet, which again is about probably an hour away from there, not only did I grow up in Cloquet, but both my parents did, my grandma did, my aunts and uncles did. It's kind of like Mayberry for us. We're all there. I had some of the same teachers that they did, but my mom's grandma played the piano for Judy Garland's dad when his vaudeville act would come through Cloquet. So it's just,
and of course, Cloquet is Jessica Lange's hometown.
Yes, exactly. Yep, I saw her one time at a restaurant in Duluth.
Yes.
But I also wanted to share with people as far as how sometimes people have to move and it's not their choice, and just kind of the emotions of not feeling centered because your home is changing, as it relates to a town called Centralia. And I discovered it when I was on a trip, and I then did some Googling about it. But basically, it's a famous town because, and it's in
In
Pennsylvania, by
Illinois?
the way.
Is it in Illinois?
It's in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. Okay.
And I'm going to read here the story here for you. But back in the 1960s, a coal seam underneath the city began to burn, and to this day, it's still burning.
Oh,
So I'll share with you here what I wrote. In 2019, I visited the ghost town, or the near ghost town, of Centralia, nestled in the foothills of northeastern Pennsylvania. In 1962, a fire spread from a landfill of seams of coal and mining tunnels beneath the town's surface. Once a close-knit mining community, it's now nearly abandoned as the fire continues to burn. Since the beginning of the fire, residents have been living with toxic gas fumes, dangerous sinkholes, and health problems. Knowing that it was cost prohibitive to continue to fight the fire, the government bought people's homes and relocated the respective families. Some residents, though, resisted, and so there are still a handful of homes. At the time of my visit, I couldn't see any smoke, but I could smell it as it seeped above ground. As I made my way through the old neighborhoods, I could see a pair of women's high-heeled shoes and children's toys scattered amongst the overgrown trees and tall grass. It was surreal to think that I was walking where children had once played, businesses had stood, and cars had once lined the street. Even though the town is mostly gone, the bare streets and empty lots still tell a story of days gone by and a fire that continues to burn. So isn't that interesting how there
heartbreaking.
was a coal mine under the town and a fire has been burning there since the 1960s and it's still burning.
And
So
it was someone's home, and this
yeah,
is what
just crazy
happened to
stuff.
us.
Yeah. And there's also there was a town up on the north shore of Minnesota, so between Duluth and then going up, heading towards Canada, if you will, but called Taconite Harbor. And I heard about that when I was little, but as I mentioned earlier, there was no way to access the internet back then. So I would hear about it once in a while, but just didn't really know anything about it. And some friends and I stopped by where the town was last summer on a trip up north. And there's still like a street light that's there. You can still see where some of the lot lines were drawn out for houses. But once the mining stopped or slowed down, the town just no longer existed. So it's
Mhm.
so surreal to see how a lot of these things are intersected, whether it's a certain town based on a certain industry, or maybe in this case, the mining company owns the mineral rights under it, or maybe you're in Texas and some oil rights are underneath the town, or who knows. But it makes you realize just kind of how important the sense of a sense of home is, and just how it can make you feel, regardless of where you are or who you're from, or where you're from,
And,
excuse me.
and when we take people up to North Hibbing, the little part that's left, it's the southwest corner of Hibbing. The original town site is still there, no buildings, but you can see the sidewalks and the curbs and the foundation for part of the Lincoln High School and the two sets of front stairs that went up to the front patio in front of the school. And I tell people, when I was growing up, there was still more land up there and there were some buildings still, but you always felt like you were in a sacred place because this was someone's home. This was someone's school. And the churches and the downtown and the library, all of that was there. And now it's gone. Most of it's in the pit. Most
Mhm.
of it, there's just the pit there. But this was home. And I
Mhm.
try to impress upon that with people that um, when we're here, we're walking on someone's memories.
Yeah, yeah, that's
And
true.
Joe and I like to go to cemeteries. We like walking in them and we like reading the names. And when you're in different parts of the country, you see different ethnic names in predominance.
Hmm.
Um, but when we walk in North Hibbing Cemetery, because the North Hibbing Cemetery is still there, only if you have a family plot there can you be buried there anymore. Otherwise, you're in the Maple Hill, the newer cemetery. But when you walk through that North Hibbing Cemetery, for instance, you see lots of gravestones for babies and children, 1918, 1919, because that was the pandemic. That was what was called the
Oh.
Spanish flu.
Mm-hmm.
That was a worldwide pandemic. And you think about the grief that came to those
Mm-hmm.
spots. And Hibbing was a beautiful, beautiful town, and we have a beautiful town now, but it you can't stop thinking about the fact that there was another one.
Exactly. And that's part of why I wanted to have this episode of the podcast. And then also in my book, how I wrote about it, because first of all, it helps people appreciate what they do have, but it also makes you have a moment of pause for the past and
Yes.
what people experience and show some respect by wanting to learn about it. And
Hmm.
I know even in Cloquet, Cloquet burned to the ground back
Yes.
in I forget if it was 1912 or what the year was, but people had to leave by train car, which was
And
interesting because it was started by a spark from a train. But so in that
some of
case,
them died in it, and some of them
yes,
jumped into rivers to try to save themselves.
yes. And so there were examples of where people like lumber companies in Cloquet would give people lumber to build a home, like a temporary small one on the back of their lot before their full house could be built. And people might say, "Oh, I feel bad that you have to live in this small house in the back of your lot." No, people were grateful that they had access to the lumber. They were grateful to have to be able to do it. And again, it's power of perspective,
Yeah.
So, but as I close things out here, do you have any uh stories that I didn't maybe ask you about that you wanted to share, or anything that you
I
wanted to
would
tell
just I
people?
would just say to people, especially if you've never heard about Hibbing, Minnesota before, put it on your bucket list.
Oh yeah.
Come and visit us. Come and visit northern Minnesota. Many times people will come through Hibbing on their way to the Boundary Waters, for instance,
Yeah.
or on their way to Ely, which is a wonderful historic town with a wolf center and the bear center. And there's a lot of neat things to do in northern Minnesota. And I think after the pandemic is when our tour numbers really jumped up, because a lot of people who live in the Midwest, who live right in Minnesota, started thinking about maybe we could travel closer to home.
Yeah.
And I would just encourage people to come up here. And if you are interested in having a tour of the high school or doing a Bob Dylan tour, if you go on the Hibbing School's website, you'll find the Hibbing High School tab. And in there, you'll see Joe and Mary Keys and our phone number. And there are a couple other tour guides as well. And you can call us and set up a tour.
Well, I myself just might do that. So I appreciate the heads up. But thank you so much for not only sharing the stories today, but also the pictures and giving people information. This is fantastic and incredibly interesting. And for those of you who are listening, thank you for being here as well. And again, feel free to go to YouTube and like and subscribe to the podcast called Emotional Grit. And thanks for being here.
Thank you.